Studies. And I want to first thank the staff who've made my visit so easy and made sure I got everywhere I needed to go. Hee-jung Che, Young-woo Kim, and Youngjin Kim. And I also am so pleased to share the days this afternoon with some dear friends of mine who are here from the Max Planck Institute and the HKW in Berlin, Katrin Klingen, Carlina Rose, and Christoph Rosel. It's good to be here with you. It's a time zone we've never been in together, actually, I think. So, good. I also want to thank my friend Bum-Soon Park and congratulate him personally for his achievement in making this center possible. I just want to congratulate him for that. I've known you 21 years, and I've always been astounded with everything that you have accomplished. So, congratulations on this. And thank you for this opportunity to speak here today. So, I have 4 hours, right? Is that about right? Yeah. So I was walking along the Gyeonggi Line Forest Park in Seoul, in the place where Korea's first major railway started construction in 1902. Today the rail line is submerged beneath the congested city, and the forest park is an urban oasis with water and trees and plenty of space for my 2 children to run and ride their scooters and make too much noise. Suddenly my phone let out a terrible sound and the screen was full of text. I could hear other people's phones in the park making the same noise. Since unfortunately I don't read Korean yet, I quickly snapped a picture and texted it to my friend. "What's happening?" I asked, a bit urgently. The summer of 2017 was an anxious one, as you may remember. My South Korean friends have grown up with post-Korean War polarization and the incessant threat of violence, but even to them I suspected that period of time was an unusual one as well. More certain of the diplomatic tactics of the North, they were highly unsure of the United States' recently elected and unpredictable reality show president. I was for that summer a visiting lecturer, a researcher in the KAIST Graduate School of Science and Technology Policy, working with Dr. Daejeon to understand the causes and implications of the 2014 sinking of the Sewol ferry, a topic to which I will return later in the talk. On arriving in South Korea, I felt alarmed to read a recommendation that I should have gas masks for my family, and that we also needed to know where to take shelter if a missile barrage were to start, and that also I shouldn't worry too much about these things. But I'm a disaster researcher, and worry is my business. Only recently, President Trump had warned North Korean President Kim Jong-un that if he continued testing missiles, the United States would rain, quote, fire and fury like the world had never seen down on Pyongyang. North Korea's response was a shrug, and then a threat to create an enveloping fire around Guam. It was around that time that one late night I got into a heated argument on social media with an old friend, a friend who had served as an American GI in South Korea in the 1990s, who told me that I needed to get out of South Korea that summer, that Trump would strike North Korea, and that he actually had to do so if there was even a chance that Kim Jong-un's nuclear weapons could reach the west coast of the United States. "And what about Seoul?" I asked him. "What are the millions here?" A picture of a city in ruins came to mind. The argument stalled with no conclusion. Meanwhile, that week, the American press was busily churning out grim scenario stories. What might happen if war returned to the Korean Peninsula? How many would die in the first hour, the first day, the first month? Some of these scenarios ended with full-blown nuclear war, while the rosier scenarios imagined only tens of thousands of civilians and soldiers being killed, primarily in Seoul and Pyongyang. Back to the Gyeonggi Line Forest Park. At last, a text message came back from my South Korean friend. "It's a weather warning," he said, "advising you to take care in the extreme heat." As I stood there squinting from the sun's glare, my shirt soaked with sweat, I appreciated the wisdom of this advisory. The reality is that the slow disaster of climate change on the Korean Peninsula is every bit as ominous as the threat of war. It's just unfolding at a pace that makes it harder for us to keep it in the front of our minds. Heat records have been broken in the South Korean summers over recent years. The old temperature mark for Seoul was shattered just this past summer in 2018, in the midst of a heat wave affecting the entire Korean peninsula and directly causing at least 42 deaths. This follows a similar heat wave in the summer of 2013. The trend is clear to climatologists. From 1971 to 2000, South Korea charted on average 8.5 heat wave days per year. By the end of this century, that number is expected to rise to 32.3 days per year, a full month every year in a heat disaster. A recent public health analysis puts the rising heat in the context of life and death. Between 2002 and 2013, 336,000 South Koreans were treated in the hospital for direct heat-related illnesses, including heat exhaustion, respiratory difficulty, and heat stroke, with the reported cases increasing steadily every year. Researchers also note an increase in heat-related illnesses, including asthma, cardiovascular disease, and insect and waterborne disease outbreaks. This is a public health disaster, especially for children and for older people. In Seoul, where a heat island effect is observable, it takes the concrete and steel city longer and longer to cool in the evening, and declining air quality due to pollution further complicates the struggle to breathe. Heat-related death rates are even higher in rural and poorer areas, where agricultural workers suffer and where elderly people often live alone and without good access to health care. Even projecting conservatively, the human costs of global warming in South Korea will be profound, especially for a country, like most industrialized countries in the world, with an aging population. Each of these effects, local to Korea, will likewise play out at the global scale, according to the most recent report from this year of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. The 21st century will be one of a gradual and deadly warming. Global, yes, but uneven in its effects, and not equitable. This warming will go much harder on the vulnerable, the poor, the young, the old, and the sick. For non-human species, the impacts will be likewise dangerous, sometimes deadly, sometimes extinction-inducing. And for the built infrastructure, shifts in heating and cooling patterns will affect roads and buildings. Water, too much in some places, too little in others, will challenge sanitation and water delivery systems. Air conditioning demand will stress the electric grid, and increasingly extreme weather events will cause damage across all types of infrastructure systems, from data to diabetes care, with higher frequency and cost. Worrying about a missile attack while baking in a heat wave. That's me on the forest line that summer day in 2017. And considering that both of these risks is anthropogenic and inherently industrial in its formation, it's also a pretty typical description of life in the Anthropocene. The Anthropocene is the time in which human activity is the dominant force of change on the planet. The terminology is in the strict sense geological, coined by atmospheric chemist Paul Crutzen in 2000. Geological ages are named for the organisms or processes that define the Earth in their time. The Anthropocene is our time, an age marked by the increasingly obvious cumulative impacts of humanity on Earth systems, and more so by the cascading effects of human-crafted systems. If you're looking for the material evidence that scientific advocates of the Anthropocene collect and analyze, you should watch for concentrations out of place. Too much phosphorus at the mouths of rivers and acid in the oceans. Too much carbon in the atmosphere. Radioactive particles and plastics everywhere. Also, look for absences. Ice is missing. Vegetative loss. Biodiversity loss. Aridity. The evidence for the Anthropocene as a stratigraphic layer of the Earth with a clear starting point is still a matter of fierce debate among scientists, divided into roughly 4 camps. Those who reject the concept out of hand, those who date the start of the Anthropocene to the advent of agriculture, approximately 10,000 years ago, those who date it to the rise of industrialization, roughly 250 years ago, and those who insist that only the entry into the nuclear age marks the moment of the Anthropocene beginning in 1945. Start date aside, there is broad consensus that a so-called great acceleration of Anthropocenic processes, from globalized industrial production to GDP to global population to oceanic surface temperatures, are obvious from the 1950s forward. Now, thinking about the implications of the Anthropocene as a scientific fact, writer Roy Scranton argues that the primary work ahead is only marginally scientific. not really about making a tidy evidence-based case for the stratigraphy. To Scranton, the real challenge lies, as he terms, in learning to die in the Anthropocene. They told you this was going to be a really uplifting lecture, right? You got that? Okay. Scranton is an Iraq War veteran who's now a writer and professor in the United States. It's worth quoting him at length here. The challenge the Anthropocene poses, he says, is a challenge not just to national security, to food and energy markets, or to our way of life, though these challenges are all real, profound, and inescapable. The greatest challenge the Anthropocene poses may be to our sense of what it means to be human. Within 100 years, within 3 to 5 generations, a period of time we can all imagine, we will face average temperatures 7 degrees Fahrenheit higher than today, rising seas at least 3 to 10 feet higher, and worldwide shifts in crop belts, growing seasons, and population centers. Within 1,000 years, unless we stop emitting greenhouse gases wholesale right now, humans will be living in a climate the Earth hasn't seen since the Pliocene, 3 million years ago, when oceans were 75 feet higher than they are today. We face the imminent collapse of the agricultural, shipping, and energy networks upon which the global economy depends. A large-scale die-off in the biosphere that's already well on its way, and our own possible extinction. If Homo sapiens, for some genetically modified variant, survives the next millenniums, it will be, he concludes, survival in a world unrecognizably different from the one we have inhabited. How long will it take? Is it too late? Is it reversible? Who will be the first to suffer, and how can their suffering be lessened? Are the same forces of industrialization that created the Anthropocene also capable of being turned towards solutions? These are the existential questions of the Anthropocene, and they go well beyond geology. The Anthropocene is by no means the first time humans have contemplated suffering, or even the complete end of humanity. Apocalyptic eschatology is quite nearly a universal feature of world religions. It's not even the first time in which humans have contemplated their end brought about by their own hand. That would be the Cold War and its mutually assured destruction era, in which a great number of us in this room grew up and came to adulthood. But it is the first time that a mass extinction, including the Anthropos, is contemplated by us as a creeping process, toxicity and global warming driving us from every corner of the globe to the same fate. It's hard sometimes not to feel perhaps some misplaced sense of pride in that we did it sort of slap on the back for Homo sapiens and our remarkable tools that we can actually change the Earth in such a profound way. But that's usually followed by a pause when we know geological ages mostly by their layering. We think through that. That is to say, we know these layers by the fact of new layers visible on top of old layers. Or to put it more definitively, geological ages end. The Anthropocene, once fully realized, will be missing the Anthropos. That is to say, we won't be here. I'm going to take up the second point now that we've sort of defined the Anthropocene and talk a little bit about some of the dynamics within the Anthropocene. Of course, when I read my friend's reassuring translation of the warning text in 2017 I was telling you about, I was relieved that war had not just been declared, obviously. This fear was replaced, though, with another one. A fear that tracks a threat just as grievous, worse even, but moving on a slower time scale. Fire and fury and enveloping fire are terrifying and even poetic phrases in their way, much more so than the rather flat global warming. But global warming is stalking me wherever I go, not only in Seoul and Pyongyang. When I went home to New Jersey, far away from the emergency drills and gas masks, it was waiting for me there too. War and climate change. Both risks are socially produced. Indeed, they are products of the same process, industrialization. But their effects are known in different geographical and temporal scales. With that observation in mind, I'd like to take a moment here to talk a bit more about disaster and some of the conceptual tools that we apply to the concept. I'm going to try to briefly take apart for you the temporal limitations of the term and its general use. For example, war is the quintessential example of an anthropogenic disaster that we can apprehend as an event in the now. In terms of definitions, war fulfills the requirements of what we generally mean by disaster. It overcomes society's ability to cope with stress. That is what war is for, after all. It's a human-induced disaster aimed at achieving political ends. As such, Warfare cannot last beyond the time frame in which it's useful for the combatants. The time frame of war is short. It may be repetitive, but it is an imminent way of destroying, killing, and dying. War and other so-called rapid onset disasters fit the definition of events. And in fact, the classic social scientific definition of disaster were framed in the early years of the Cold War. These definitions were made when governments, especially in the United States, were funding research to model the societal impact of nuclear war. The model of disaster that emerged by 1960 in the writings coming from the Disaster Research Center in the United States was something that arrives rapidly. Disaster happens rapidly, with little or no warning, and then it's over. They were using nuclear attack as their model of what disaster is. In that aftermath phase, after the nuclear attack, that's where the government planners were keen to know what might happen. Would society return to some sort of normalcy, or would society fall apart at the seams? Their conclusions weren't optimistic, but are slightly beside the point here. What's important is to note that their framing of disaster as an event really stuck, the result of a shock from outside, overwhelming a particular community at a particular time. This became the benchmark sort of idea for what disaster was in the social sciences. The Anthropocene is also a disaster, but it's a slow one, moving according to a different temporal logic. The traditional definition of disaster describes an overwhelming event delimited by spatio-temporal limits that are tightly bounded with clear cause and effect relationships. Slow disaster is a way to think about disasters not as discrete events, but as long-term processes linked across time. The slow disaster stretches both back in time and forward across generations to indeterminate points, punctuated by moments we've traditionally conceptualized as disaster, but in fact claiming much more life, health, and wealth across time than is generally calculated. The slow disaster is the time scale at which technological systems decay, the scale at which post-traumatic stress grinds its victims. This is the scale at which deferred maintenance of infrastructure takes its steady toll, often in ways hard to sense or monetize until a disaster occurs in event time. Something happens rapidly. The experience of war victims fits the concept well, as does the process of climate change, sea level rise, or the intensification of coastal flooding and heat waves. This image here on the right, on the top, is lower Louisiana in the United States in 1932. In the bottom, it's 2011. The Mississippi Delta is disappearing. And Hurricane Katrina is a disaster event that reflects this longer-term process. But you cannot understand Katrina without understanding the slow disaster of the disappearance of Louisiana. As climate scientist Will Steffen described the conceptual challenge before us in 2011, he said, both the slow and quick onset events, coupled with the increasing connectivity of the human enterprise, can lead to some unexpected global crises, such as spikes in food prices. The Earth system scale adds another twist to the concept of the speed of change. As for the very large geophysical changes that have exceptionally long lag times, but may then occur suddenly with potential devastating effects. Humanity, he observes, now largely in its post-agrarian phase of development, has no experience dealing with such combinations of scale and speed of environmental change. We're constantly moving fast and slow. It makes us dizzy. So to sum up, if we accept the Anthropocene as our modern condition, the premise of the founding of this center, then there's no longer any use in us dividing disasters into false binaries like human and natural, or natural and technological. The Anthropocene concept, if it does anything at all, dispels us of the notion that some malevolent external force of nature is ruining our good time here on Earth. Likewise, we should be open to disaster as an inherently social process, one that can play out with immediacy or over long stretches of time with indeterminate beginning and ending points. And yet, the old false binaries confront us at every turn. In the aftermath of a disaster, for example, like Hurricane Katrina, or the sinking of the Sewol ferry, or the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear disaster, the disaster is often presented as a laboratory of sorts. After each of these, we hear a great deal from policymakers and experts about the opportunity to learn from disaster. But we should be aware that this learning exercise is trapped in a dynamic that splits the technical from the social. In this mode, if the technical side of a disaster yields inconclusive results, then it's very hard for experts to reform technical practice. Strong pressures exist within technical expert communities to resist outside social and political influences. This is, in many ways, perceived as the very definition of science and engineering, to be able to deliver analysis and deliver technology that's free from context, relieved of the corruptions of the social world. Of course, such avoidance in the Anthropocene is not only impossible, but the idea that disasters are not combinations of technical but also social and political forces is not just wrong, it's dangerous. Post-disaster investigations are often demanded by government officials, seeking to have rapid and acceptable answers to technical questions, seeking to move quickly past useful moments for debate over the larger forces at play in risk-taking. This rush to learn something, anything, that can restart the reactors or reopen the floodplain for construction puts engineers especially into a very difficult position. And I know, because I've talked to them about it, in this very tight spot that they find themselves in. What if what is learned from disaster is that there should be more technological restraints in a certain ecosystem? Or that the unwanted effects of an industrial process aren't knowable yet? What then is the lesson of disaster? Is it useless? No, it's not. But perhaps the answer will be unpopular and not attuned to the event scale of disaster that so often demands our attention. If you're with me so far, nobody's walked out, I don't think, then you might be wondering, as I often do, in whose interest has it been to define disaster as an event in the now, as an act of God, or as an unwanted external natural event? By way of an answer, what you will have immediately observed from the discussion thus far is the lack of texture when it comes to ascribing human agency in the Anthropocene. To say the era started with industrialization is intuitively correct, but it's like saying a murder was committed by some criminals at some point in the past. We want to know more. Who were these criminals? Where was the crime committed? What were the motives? In their essential 2015 book, The Shock of the Anthropocene, Christophe Benaille and Jean-Baptiste Drexel put the problem of causation and agency in the Anthropocene directly before us. They say, there is already an official narrative of the Anthropocene. We, the human species, unconsciously destroyed nature to the point of hijacking the Earth system into a new geological epoch. In the late 20th century, they note, a handful of Earth system scientists finally opened our eyes. This is the official narrative of the Anthropocene already. But they say the story of this awakening is a fable. The opposition between a blind past and a clear-sighted present, besides being historically false, depoliticizes the long history of the Anthropocene. So the challenge before us now is twofold. First, we have to build historically rich accounts of the Anthropocene. This is a globally active process manifesting itself across a countless set of local domains. Second, we must also attend to the ways that the Anthropocene discourse is shaping our understanding in the now. Who gets to say when it started? Who doesn't? Why does that matter? Rising to this challenge has been a legion of scholars offering historically contextualized modifications to the notion of Anthropocene as a process. These scholars are looking to take apart that duplicitous we and actually put some names with faces, so to speak. This slide is going to give you a sampling of some of this work. This is not comprehensive in any way, but these are, if you will, the different theories of what I might call the social tectonics of the Anthropocene. When we think of geology, we think of plate tectonics, right? The force that's shaping the Earth. Well, what are the social tectonics of the Anthropocene? What are the forces behind the creation of industrialization? These are non-geological forces that are altering the Earth's crust just as effectively as volcanism or meteor strikes have done in previous geological times. Note especially the Capitalocene, departing from the old line attributed to Frederick Jameson. I'd like to go my whole career and come up with a line like this. That we can envision the end of the world more readily than we can envision the end of capitalism. The Capitalocene has some utility in addressing my previous question about the limits of learning from disaster. In this mode of thinking about the Anthropocene, it makes complete and total sense that learning will be bounded by what? By the limits of ownership and profitability. We probably won't land on one of these definitions today as the correct definition to an amorphous Anthropocene, but this may, I hope, generate some discussion for us later on. There's a caution here, too, that I feel compelled to share with you. There could be some powerful social psychological factors at work here as well when it comes to risk perception. There's fascinating work on this produced by economists, psychologists, and risk experts. For example, when I read the text message from my friend in the summer of 2017, Why did I immediately think, I couldn't read it by the way, but when I saw the text, why did I immediately think about war and not about the slow disaster of climate change in the Anthropocene? Is there something about my wiring, our wiring, that focuses us more on the now and quite frequently on the risk that I have a mental model of? So why am I focused on something I can imagine, like war, rather than on the slow and the more abstract? There's even an argument out there about the evolutionary advantage of forgetting. And if this is true, historians have many more problems than we actually thought. But perhaps there's something to explore more here. Our human forgetfulness is in this way of thinking it's a feature, not a bug. It helps us move on from catastrophe and start again, if this is the way we've evolved. I'm still not quite ready to excuse human behavior in the Anthropocene as the mere fact of our evolutionary inheritance, but there is definitely much more work for us to do in the area of risk perception and risk communication in the Anthropocene. And so, the Anthropocene as a concept has slipped beyond the jurisdiction of the International Commission on Stratigraphy. The Anthropocene as social process is now a mode of inquiry seen everywhere where people are interested in disasters and ways to prevent them. As an environmental studies heuristic device, it has some serious advantages. It's inherently interdisciplinary. It traffics in deep time and demands attention to scales from the planetary to the street corner. And it forces us to divest ourselves of the age-old natural disaster. In the Anthropocene, it's human activity itself, interwoven into the natural that shapes reality. When I say social, I want to be clear here that I do not mean this is only a conversation among historians and sociologists, especially make that point here at KAIST. And I teach at an engineering university as well. It's my privilege to do so. Technological systems are built by and for humans via social processes. Political structures, laws, regulations, and economies are likewise technologies, merely forged through more explicitly social forces. Science itself, and I don't really need to explain this in this room, but science itself has history. It has power relations among its practitioners, and the formation of scientific knowledge and facts is deeply enmeshed in social structures. Building knowledge formation centers and methods that are explicit about blurring disciplinary, scalar, and temporal lines is an absolute necessity. It's made highly desirable by the upsurge of interest in the Anthropocene, and it's, of course, that promise that brings us here today. So there's only one place in the world where a person can see the Anthropocenic future in its full revelation. A place that simultaneously fully represents humanity while also being devoid of living humans. This place happens to be just 116 miles from here, the demilitarized zone separating North and South Korea. 155 miles long and 2.5 miles wide, the DMZ is the world's longest defended borderland. And by virtue of this fact, it is also the world's largest space uninhabited by humans. I rode the Gyeonggi line from Seoul Station to the DMZ. Most of the trip would feel predictable to anyone who's ever left a major metropolitan city by train. High-rises give way to lesser high-rises, smog gives way to clearer skies. But after about an hour, the so-called peace train, beautifully decorated with bright flowers and showing cheerful videos, slows considerably, and then you become aware of changes in the land. An intensification of the greens and the blues, and a heightened awareness on board as the fences and the soldiers come into view. I disembarked at Daejeon Station, just south of the border. A beautiful, modern station that was empty. It took me some time before I understood that this was, and is meant to someday again, be a border crossing. A soaring waiting room is edged by a tourism information desk. There was never anybody at the desk, nobody came, but presumably it was there to provide aid for South Koreans headed north and for their North Korean peers headed south. One can even see the border crossing station itself, where passports will be checked and bags inspected. And there is the departures board. Pyongyang is listed. I looked at that for a long time. We left Daejeon Station and arrived shortly by bus to a strange little platform where a mine train waited for us. I sat down in a small car, no enclosure, with 3 others. A woman with her 2 children. The instructions came rapidly and in Korean, but I took it from the hard hat that they handed to me. I was supposed to keep my head down and not stand up. Just then, the car lurched and started creakily down a steep incline. My rail car mates, as it turned out, spoke perfect English. The woman was a native South Korean, she'd married an American, and her two boys were being raised in both cultures. Maybe it was my claustrophobia, but this was the most anxious I felt that entire summer. Hiding underground in a tunnel with water dripping on my helmet. Without the concrete barricade and barbed wire, you might have thought you were in an abandoned coal mine. But the guides never let you forget that this is a tunnel for war, and for the express purpose of moving an army to Seoul. I exited as soon as possible and, not waiting for the return train, walked up and out the steep pedestrian walkway. From here, we were ushered into a cheerful theater. The juxtaposition was hard to take in. In the theater, there was a short film that told us three basic stories. I can summarize them for you very quickly. First, the historic story of the war and the partitioning of the Korean Peninsula. Second, the continuing depravity of the North Korean military, with its incessant tunneling and the imminent threat to democracy in the South. I was prepared, especially after my tunnel experience, to receive these messages in a new sort of way. North Korea was eager for reunification, the film told me, but it wouldn't be a peaceful one. The tunnel was the evidence, the film instructed me. Remember the tunnels, it said. Don't lose sight of the tunnels. The third part of the film caught me really quite unprepared. Because of the incomparable situation of the DMZ, its 400 square miles of unhumanity, it is in fact the world's largest wildlife and botanical refuge. The buoyant tone of the film carried us to the conclusion that when, not if, but when Korea is reunited, as the film said, the nation will be left with this amazing park, a so-called peace and life zone, a reminder of its past transformed into a beautiful symbol of peace. I couldn't help but wonder about the alternative endings for this film. The ending where the reunification doesn't easily occur, and the DMZ serves as a militarized wildlife refuge for millennia, not decades. Or maybe a different ending, darker still. The social tectonics of the Anthropocene eventually render the DMZ useless because of societal collapse. I now began to see the DMZ as an experiment station for life after humans. As I contemplated this last idea, the guides herded us back onto the bus for the pinnacle of the tour. A visit to the mountainside lookout where visitors peer across the DMZ and into the North Korean border town of Kijeongdong. I looked across that emptiness. I was actually desperate to see a person. I was looking for a real North Korean. But I only saw the streets, smokestacks, and houses of Kijeongdong. I actually found out later that Kijeongdong and another small village opposite on the South Korean side, Daejeon, had been engaging for decades in propaganda warfare, with huge loudspeakers set up in each village broadcasting pleas to the farmers and soldiers of the other side to walk across the border to freedom. These two towns had also engaged in what's called a battle of the flags. In the 1980s, the South Korean government had erected a 323-foot-tall flagpole in Daejeon. North Korea followed with a 525-foot-tall flagpole in its response. I also found out later that I was looking for people in vain. Kijeongdong is only a model town. Apparently, no one lives there. The lights go off and on in the buildings controlled remotely with timers, and soldiers disguised as civilians sweep the streets. I was standing on the edge of the most heavily monitored, seen, listened to, tunneled, and militarized spot on the planet, and I felt profoundly lonely. It was a place unlike any other, and yet totally representative of what the Anthropocene portends. High-tech, war-torn, and empty of human beings. Now, if you forget humans for a moment, there's definitely life in the DMZ. There are actually over 5,000 species of plants and animals here, including 106 that are endangered and protected. The geography of the DMZ from one side of the peninsula to the other crosses many different types of ecosystems. It was first proposed as a park in 1966, though the idea has still not been accepted by North Korea. Thousands of migrating birds from across Asia stop here every year. These include the famous red-crowned and white-naped crane. Siberian tigers are rumored to be here as well. These are, for now, the residents of the proposed peace and life zone of the DMZ. But what if we excavated the Anthropocene layer at the DMZ? What if we went on a discovery mission for the Korean Anthropocene? What would we find? Could we put together a coherent account of human life and human death on Earth, in this place? Let's try. Start with the North Korean border towns of Daejeon and Kaesong. Each has a deep human history, with remnants of early farming cultures dating back to the Neolithic period over 10,000 years ago. Pottery and stone tools have been found here, and a long history of small-scale empire building through agriculture and through warfare. We could have a look inside Gung Yi's castle, ruins of a 10th century civilization that sits abandoned today in the center of the DMZ. Closer to the surface, we would discover the industrial layer, zinc mines close to the border, and of course railroad tracks. That very railway where my voyage started, the Gyeonggi Line, passes through the DMZ. In its excavation, we might come to know a much more complicated history of the ways that imperialism and industrialization have shaped the DMZ. The Gyeonggi Line, though planned by the Korean government in the late 19th century, was replanned and built by the Imperial Japanese government that occupied Korea from 1910 to 1945. This railway line was seen by the Japanese colonizers as the tool of modernization in the peninsula, unifying the economic regions of Manchuria and allowing for rapid deployment of Japanese troops throughout the region. Industrialization and violence, together as always. The DMZ will hold traces of this imperial past, underneath a thicker layer of debris marking the Korean War from 1950 to 1953. Specially authorized excavations here, for example, in the 1990s and 2000s, have uncovered 64 South Korean war dead from those years. One layer closer to the surface, we will find undoubtedly the markers of atmospheric nuclear testing. That's a global marker, shared everywhere. And the most dangerous reminder of industry here is actually right at that level. It's estimated there are 2 million landmines in the DMZ. Now let's come up to the surface layer of our time. Since 2002, the jointly managed Kaesong Industrial Region has offered the promise of collaboration by the North and South, a sort of proto-reunification experiment. Closed for a while, and it's apparently due to reopen, as I just read. It's telling us that industrial production is seen as the most promising way to accomplish détente. To both North and South since 1953, moving towards vastly different political goals, intensified industrialization has been the strategy. The Anthropocene, we might say, is ideologically pluralistic. To paraphrase Ulrich Beck, industrialization can be authoritarian or it can be democratic. Pollution is pollution, and it doesn't respect boundaries. We don't know how this Anthropocenic excavation will end. Another war, debris, and nuclear layer? Or a thicker layer marking the slow disaster of warming, aridity, and pollution? Or is there another option? I don't think any of us would be willing to work on the Anthropocene research we're here to do. I know I wouldn't. In engineering and design, in medicine and health, in science and the social sciences, if we didn't actually, maybe quietly, hold on to the idea that a course correction is possible. That a path away from the apocalypse is at hand, and that we don't have to die in the Anthropocene after all. That the field notes of the Anthropocenic DMZ excavation may indeed someday be collected by a person visiting a wildlife refuge. In closing my remarks today, I want to say a few words about the challenge at hand. And I'll do that by reminding you briefly of the tragedy of April 16, 2014, when the Sewol ferry sank, killing 304 passengers and crew. The passengers were largely high school students, excited with life, on their way to a well-earned vacation at Jeju Island. The disaster that occurred is still under investigation. The failures of the government have yet to be fully explored or corrected, and the memorial to the victims is yet to be built. It is a disaster ongoing, and one that tore South Korean society apart. I point to the Sewol as a prime example of a disaster in the Anthropocene. The ship itself was only one piece of technology in a massive and complex transportation system, the outgrowth of an industrial system that has utterly transformed South Korean life since the 1950s. As a product of this industrialization, the nation has witnessed disasters, fast and slow, as I discussed in the opening of my talk today. Bridge collapses in the moment, water pollution at a slower scale. Subway fires in an instant, air pollution over decades. Bringing these two timescales together in one analytical frame is made possible by an Anthropocenic type of analysis. That's its main advantage, I think. To be more specific, industrialization transformed South Korean life, but it did not guarantee democratization. That process came along in fits and starts and was only complete in the 90s. In my research here, I've come time and time up against a sort of outrage at the Sewol disaster. Yes, about the loss of innocent lives, but also about the failures of a regulatory system in an industrialized democracy that's supposed to guarantee that the machines work well, that they don't kill people. With my KAIST colleague Daejeon and our research assistant Hyewon Kim, we conducted interviews in 2017 over the summer, trying to get a deeper understanding of the Sewol disaster. We interviewed members of the first major independent investigation commission, a commission that never really got started before partisanship rendered it unable to ask the hardest questions about the disaster. It was a disaster after the disaster, I would say. To put it a different way, learning from the Sewol ferry disaster was hindered by the realities of politics and the strong desire of the government to get back to normal as quickly as possible. Out of time and out of money, the commission left its work unfinished. Learning is not so easy after all. We also interviewed family members that summer, an astounding, brave, and highly organized group that has been attacked in the press and by the previous government. Nevertheless, the families have pushed for truth and for memory. A second commission is now underway, and the ship itself has been raised from the floor of the sea, itself a one-of-a-kind technical achievement. But what can we learn from the ship once the technical questions have been answered, once the memorial is built? Will it become a center of learning? A nagging reminder that governance and technology are not separate entities in the Anthropocene? This is Professor John with Pooja Chong, a mother of one of the victims of the Sewol disaster, in the memory classroom in Ansan. This is a reconstruction of the classrooms in which the students never returned to after their death. And there's a sort of a discussion, is maybe too mild, a debate about what's going to happen with this memory classroom. It's a really profound space. The second commission, as I mentioned, is underway. What can we learn from the ship? Will it be a center of learning? These are the questions on my mind. I hope so, and I hope for that outcome. The basic demand of the Sewol victim family members is that the Sewol not be forgotten. Their concern is as simple as it is ambitious, that the nation and the world learn something fundamental about the responsibilities of government and of citizens to protect life and safety in a highly technological society. In that way, I don't see the Sewol victim families in any different from the families still grieving their loved ones who died in the World Trade Towers on September 11, or the families of victims in Bhopal, or in Fukushima, or even the families who grieve for the dead of war anywhere in the world today. Their grief takes us directly into the seriousness of the work you propose to do here. To be honest and inquisitive about the frailty of human life in an industrialized, let me try that again. To be honest and inquisitive about the frailty of human life in an industrialized world, in a warming world, in the Anthropocene. That's the work. In the demands of the Sewol families and in their strength, I draw a challenge for the Center for Anthropocene Studies at KAIST. As Director Bumsun Park says in his outstanding welcome message, and you should go online and read it, the KAIST Center for Anthropocene Studies, he says, does not believe there's a quick, ready-made technical solution to the existential problems we and the Earth are facing now. He goes on, the Center's activities include not only research, but education and engagement in the form of public lectures, museum displays, policy issue papers, and participatory events. We want to reshape us and the Earth together, he concludes. This willingness to look for solutions as nuanced and layered as the problems of the Anthropocene itself is admirable, and it's a pretty tall order. You will be challenged to actually do interdisciplinarity, where most people, almost everyone, just talks about it. But with the array of talent across disciplines here at KAIST, and the unique opportunity to bring engineers directly into this type of work, that interdisciplinarity and that opportunity is raised to a new level. You will be challenged also to work with community partners, not just near them or for them, but with them. You'll be challenged to show the results of your research actually bending the curve of South Korean industrial society more towards democracy and towards what we might call sustainability, or in a more dire formulation, you're bending the curve towards what we might just call survival. With that, I'm going to close my talk and will thank you all for your attention and wish my very best success for the Center for Anthropocene Studies. Good luck.